Oh, my eyes are getting. The text is a bit small too. It might be better if I put it on the computer. A mysterious phone call. Today we'll talk about a mysterious phone call. At that time, His Holiness was holding a Pure Land Dharma assembly which lasted for 15 days. The Dharma throne where His Holiness taught during the Dharma assembly is now in front of the main gate of our Larung Buddhist Academy. At that time it was to commemorate His Holiness's great Pure Land Dharma assembly. Now there are 2 Dharma thrones right by the roadside. If you pass by there in the future, I think you should pay respects to them. It's right next to the main gate now. When we go up, on the left side, there are 2 Dharma thrones here. One is Lama Mamtso's Dharma throne, and one is the commemorative throne from when His Holiness held the Pure Land Dharma assembly. One afternoon, His Holiness had just finished teaching. I don't know who it was at that time, but someone came to tell His Holiness that Khenpo Namdrol had already called and asked him to go to the township government office to answer the phone. At that time, His Holiness had quite an urgent temperament, whether going out or sometimes if to depart at 6 o'clock tomorrow, he'd ask at 5, "Are we not going out?" So those of us who followed His Holiness had to be quite prepared at all times. Usually the time wouldn't be delayed, but we'd often set out early. I remember once when we went to Mount Wutai, on the way back we stayed at Baoguo Temple. Everyone was staying at Baoguo Temple. Baoguo Temple, the one at the foot of Mount Amy. In the morning they said 6 o'clock, but His Holiness was already out by 5. Everyone was still sleeping there, and everyone was terribly worried. Then our vehicle arrived, and we immediately, at that time there weren't the so-called buses we have now, everyone rode in cargo trucks. Then I climbed up onto the cargo truck, felt around, and my wallet was gone. The vehicle was about to leave immediately, so I quickly jumped down from the vehicle, went to where I'd been sleeping in the grass, and just managed to find my wallet. Then, with wallet in hand, as I ran back, the vehicle was about to leave, so they started pulling me up and I followed behind. At that time, Mount Amy also, all the roads were dirt roads, so I kept up. So His Holiness sometimes had a sense of time that was quite urgent. At that time, His Holiness hadn't yet had time to recite the aspiration prayer of Samantabhadra, then immediately stood up from the Dharma throne and told me to go too, because I already knew beforehand about this trip, but I also didn't know. At that time there wasn't even a fax machine. When I went outside I saw a fax machine for the first time. At that time the so-called concept of fax machines in China, perhaps they existed, but I hadn't seen one. It was especially rare at that time. To communicate across the ocean you could write letters, and letters could be received in other places, but at our academy there was nothing like that. At that time the entire Nubsur Township office had only one landline phone, and at that time Nubsur Township was even lower down than the current Nubsur Township. Later their township government moved up. Then we drove over there. That office, in my impression, was very run down. The phone was also, that landline was very dirty. At that time on the phone His Holiness said, "I'm Jigpun," because His Holiness often referred to himself as Jigpun, an abbreviation. At this time the phone quality was particularly poor. There was a lot of static and the sound was very small. Then His Holiness had me answer. I couldn't make it out either. It was very difficult to hear. His Holiness would answer for a bit, then I would answer. But after struggling for a long time, we finally understood fairly clearly that Khenpo Namdrol had gone from India to Hong Kong, then from Hong Kong had arrived in Chengdu. Over there, much of His Holiness's travel itinerary was basically ready, and at each stop, including the timing, things were quite tight. He asked us to bring our ID cards and passports down as quickly as possible to apply for visas, otherwise it would be very difficult. At this time, because His Holiness was teaching for the Pure Land Dharma Assembly, there were very many people, hundreds of thousands, so temporarily, at that time, we probably didn't have the concept that for visa applications the person must be present in person. His Holiness couldn't get away. The next day I took the passports of those of us who were going abroad, because the people going abroad from here were only myself and Lama Mumtso, Ani Medron and His Holiness. I brought all our documents and headed down. Before this, we had also gone down to Chengdu to handle some things. At that time, it seemed the way of applying for passports was not quite the same as now in some places. Then, after I arrived in Chengdu, I first went to find Khenpo Namdrol. Then together we went to the US consulate. This consulate, a few years ago, after Trump came to power, later they closed it. It should have been there since the 60s. I remember it being like that, though the time in my impression, at that time the consulate had 2 buildings and a small courtyard. At that time many people were being rejected, and I saw a girl wearing grey who was extremely heartbroken after being rejected. She kept crying there and collapsed on the ground. There was also another person who said they stamped something, and after this person received it, he said not only was the visa denied, but this person had issues and couldn't leave the country. They stamped it like that. I don't know if they still do that now, but that was my impression at the time. Whether this kind of situation still exists now at this time, actually, I was quite anxious too. On one hand, I very much wanted to go with His Holiness because America is a developed country, and Canada and these places, it would still be very interesting. On the other hand, perhaps there was no hope at all this time, and after arriving there, we learned that for visa applications, the person must be present in person no matter what. There was no way around it. So we submitted the documents of 3 people. His Holiness and the other 3 hadn't come, including my own passport. We submitted everything to them. And they didn't process visa applications every day. It seemed like once or twice a week. At that time, I gave him our several people's passports. When giving them to him, in my impression, there was someone with red hair and a high nose, very tall, who should have been a Westerner. He looked at the passports, then looked at us, and asked what we were going to America for, and whether we'd been there before, asking some questions. But when answering, it should have been he was satisfied. At first they said if the person didn't come in person, it definitely wouldn't work. Later we explained that our side has a great master holding a large Dharma assembly with many people. If we came here, there would be no way to handle many things there. We asked if they could be flexible about it and so on, saying these kinds of things. Then at this time, that person, seeing us people wearing red robes, seemed to be very interested, completely different attitude from others. Finally, he started stamping the approvals. At this time, after getting the visas in hand, I felt it was very interesting. I returned to Khenpo Namdrol's hotel. At this time I discovered the hotel where Khenpo Namdrol was staying was quite high class. I mentioned this before in my India travel journal. Next to the Provincial Ethnic Affairs Commission guest house, there was a hotel for Tibetan compatriots reception office. At that time, so-called hotels in China were very rare. Then after I went in, there was even a little carpet in the hallway. After going in, there was a landline phone inside. At that time, for me, this seemed very interesting. It was the first time seeing such a high-end hotel, the first time in my life seeing something like this. At that time, while we were chatting in the hotel for a while, Khenpo asked me very strangely, "How did you know my hotel's phone number?" Then at that time I said, "Didn't you call us? Didn't you have us go to Nubza Township government to answer?" Then Khenpo said, very surprised that he had no idea Nubza Township government had a phone. He said at that time when he arrived in Chengdu, at first he couldn't make contact either. When trying to make contact on the Sirtha side, he said there were 2 offices with phones. One was the Religious Affairs Bureau, where there was a bureau chief, and one was the Commerce Bureau, someone who I think has already passed away now. He had their office phone numbers, but no matter how hard he tried calling, he couldn't reach them. He didn't know about the academy, and the academy didn't have a phone either. So he felt he was wasting time, but there was nothing he could do. He went out to eat something, then in the afternoon, feeling a bit tired while he was dozing off, he said the phone in his hotel room rang directly. Then when he picked up the phone, it said, I'm Jigpun. That's how the whole thing happened. Everyone knows that at that time, generally speaking, local calls within cities and long-distance calls were very expensive, generally so much per hour, and international calls were even more expensive. But we ourselves at this time had a long-distance call, and for this long-distance call, Khenpo Namdrol didn't pay, and our side didn't pay either. We thought he had called us, and he thought we had called him. It truly was extraordinary. I'm not telling everyone lies about this because Khenpo Namdrol is still alive now. When I wrote this Memoirs of the Western Journey, I didn't communicate with him first, so if anyone doesn't believe it, they can ask him too, because later we met several times all the way up to a few years ago. Once when we were in a hotel, Khenpo was also saying this was very extraordinary. He still believes to this day that we called him, while on my end, he truly called us. So from a worldly perspective, this is a mystery. Perhaps it was some Dharma protector, or perhaps it was connected through some other means, but both of us up to now have no clue how this call was connected. So I'm placing this episode, which is a very true story here. This is the first part of what I'm sharing with everyone today. The second part is relatively brief. After we got the visas, I returned, and when I came back, the Pure Land Dharma Assembly hadn't ended yet. After getting the visas, His Holiness also seemed very happy. As the Dharma gathering was nearing its end, His Holiness announced publicly down below in Nubzur, he announced publicly there that he was going to the West. At that time he also said, this time when I go, it's not for sightseeing, not for excitement. I still have a very important purpose of spreading the Dharma and benefiting beings, and this time if I don't return, I may not return, there are some challenges, but if I can go, there will be many benefits from spreading the Dharma, different from previous trips. He asked the monastics to definitely recite for the Dharma protectors and recite other scriptures as well. His Holiness also said at that assembly who his traveling companions would be. Outside there would be Khenpo Namdrol and the others, and on the inside there was me. His Holiness said, this place is very far away, and we these people don't know if we can return. His Holiness said, I've already discussed with my sister and Khandra Mumso, and they've agreed that even if we can't return, it doesn't matter. But as for Khenpo Sodargye, Duomang Monastery has a good relationship with our side, and Tulku Techa and Khenpo Depa probably won't give him trouble if he doesn't return. At that time, I was thinking to myself, am I really not coming back or what? I was a bit concerned. Because generally speaking, no matter who it is, when it comes to things about oneself, one remembers quite clearly. Whether it's praise or criticism, one remembers quite clearly. At that time, my heart sank a bit. Does this mean I won't be able to return? But if I couldn't return, that was also fine. As long as I could go with His Holiness, that would also be very good. Moreover, at that time when we held the Pure Land Dharma Assembly, there were quite a lot of people, many from my hometown too. When His Holiness spoke about me like this, at the Pure Land Dharma Assembly I was a bit pleased, because when I first ordained, it seemed many people, including our relatives and friends, my uncles, they all said I was worthless. Just when I was about to start receiving a salary, I had departed from home, and now in a small mud hut in Larungar, I was waiting bitterly to die. They had all kinds of criticisms. At that time I thought many people from my hometown had come, and they all heard that going with His Holiness was a kind of honor. I had this kind of pride and some impure thoughts. At that time I had such feelings. Later, His Holiness also asked the monastics, the Khenpos and Khenmos, at the academy. At that time the academy had about 1,000 people, not very many, to study and practice well. Before departing from among the Han monastics, I I selected, I should remember, one was Khenpo Sodargye. She had already received her degree in 1991, and there was also Khenpo Sodargye, who at that time hadn't yet received his Khenpo degree, maybe in 1996 or sometime, but at that time he already had sufficient teaching capability. I had them teach the guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life. My parents at that time didn't really want to go back and temporarily wanted to stay at the academy, so I borrowed a black tent and set it up in the current Mani treasure area near my house and had them stay there. The appearance of parents here when making a movie, there are some important characters at the beginning who will also appear later. So when writing a script, the description of these characters is indispensable. Everyone should pay attention to that. Just joking. This trip abroad, although compared to going to India before, I still had some experience, because I had gone to the Kham region with His Holiness, had been to Mount Wutai, and had also been to India. But this time, due to costs and various reasons, we couldn't take many people. From here they could only take me, one person. When we went to India, Lama Sotan was mainly responsible for food and daily life, those aspects, and Lama Repa was responsible for His Holiness's medicine. But this time, His Holiness also said there's no one else, you must take on everything yourself. I had to handle clothing, food, housing and transportation, as well as his physical well-being, and also be responsible for some Dharma matters, including making preparations. There was indeed some pressure. So I remember throughout the entire 3-month period I carried a heavy yellow bag with me at all times. I bought that when I returned from India. At that time, not many people at the academy, Indian monastics, often carried those purple and yellow-colored bags. I had a red bag that was already a bit worn out, so for going abroad, I brought this new yellow backpack. Inside the backpack were all kinds of His Holiness's medicines, and also my own camera, including voice recorder, tape recorder, and notebook. Actually, no voice recorder, but tape recorder and so on. After making all kinds of preparations on June 12th, the second day after the Dharma gathering ended, we left Larong Academy. Many people came to see us off, and some people followed us all the way to Kangding. Then in the afternoon, we arrived in Kangding, where we met an old friend of His Holiness. He also reminded us at that time that things were quite tense in various ways now, and it would be best to leave through another place as quickly as possible, which might be more convenient. Then we also found a way leave on the 13th. That old leader has now already passed away. I've mentioned him in other books as well. He didn't do anything illegal, but some of the methods truly showed kindness toward His Holiness and toward us. We are grateful for that. Later, when he passed away, we also performed some deliverance practices for him and some Dharma services. Then on the 13th, our convoy departed from Kangding and arrived in Chengdu. On the morning of the 14th, we took the 5 a.m. flight and arrived in Guangzhou. Right when we arrived in Guangzhou, it was approaching noon, and at that time there was a woman wearing red clothes, probably in her 40s, who looked like a woman with great merit. She said she had been waiting for us at the airport. Then when we came down, she had already arranged all the accommodation, but none of us knew her. Because there was only me and the others, Khenpo Namdrol and them would only be there in Hong Kong. I didn't know her, and Alak Rigtsin and Khandra Mumtso didn't know her either. I said, I don't dare trust this. If she arranged everything including food and lodging, I didn't dare trust it, so I didn't agree. Later, His Holiness said, she looks like a devoted Buddhist, it should be fine, let her make the arrangements. Then she took us to a hotel and in a private dining room invited us for lunch. When inviting us for lunch, it was the first time I entered a rather nice private room, a quite upscale private room in a restaurant. After we had lunch, she arranged accommodation in a 3-story building here. Then we stayed there for one night. Tomorrow I'll start going abroad. All right, that's all for today.
Sodargye Om Bandharangara Padma Sodargye Om Bandharangara Padma Sodargye